Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Joanna Hearne's I'm Not a Fairy Tale, Indigenous Storytelling on Canadian television. For the past, whenever, let's just start arbitrarily in 1812. Let's just start with the publication of the Brothers Grimm's Kinder und Hausmärchen, the first edition of that. The idea of which was an incredibly popular and influential work, and inspired folklore collecting, folk narrative collecting, fairy tale collecting for much of the 19th century. It wasn't the only piece of work that did that. They weren't the only ones, but it was certainly an incredibly prominent one. And one of the things that it did is it turned attention towards these tales, towards folk literature within a particular area, and transformed it into something other. It transformed it into literature and children's literature, really emphasizing the children's literature. If you look at the difference between the first and the fifth editions of the Brothers Grimm, and look at how it was received and look at what it influenced, you see that there was just this correlation between these stories and then what they ought to be. And what they ought to be, the sort of simplistic idea of what a fairy tale was something basically to entertain and to educate and to inculcate values in children. And so as it entered into a textual tradition, it became something that, first of all, it brought these tales back to the middle classes because they were exercises in this sort of nationalism and this development of a national literature. And then they became something that would be read to children. And so as you see the edits over the years, some ambiguous morality of the first edition, whether that morality is about property, or whether that morality is about sex, gets ironed out. So the fifth one is reasonably tame. And you're probably familiar with the cliche about, like, oh, these tales, they weren't told for children. And that is true, but there's a complicated history. But just as important is the idea that they became texts. They became something to be read. So for much of the as we live in the shadow of the Grimms and their legacy, which is a positive legacy, but there are consequences to it. And one of those things is that for the most part, Western Europeans, the colonizer groups, the large portion of their access to traditional storytelling, quote unquote, is through the medium of print. And then, for the past 100 years, through the medium of film and television as well. And we tend, and I'll use the colonial we already fetishize the text. We already defer to the text. And that's one of the reasons why, one of the things that Hearne notes in this is something that Christina Bachilega pointed out, and the way that Disney films, for example, when they want to sort of establish their authority or they want to make a connection with the tradition, they begin with the opening of a book of fairy tales. They don't begin with someone telling the tale or depicting it. Their chain of authority is text as opposed to orality. And so we've now had 200 years of a print tradition, a century of a mediated tradition. There is stuff in other popular media, like the Victorian stage and pantomime in the 19th century. There are many other aspects that touches on, but we're going to be talking about television, and we're going to be talking about film and television and that, the depiction, the introduction of a medium, and a medium that has its own conventions. Television has, an audio-visual homeostatic form is different from orality, for good, for ill. Let's not put these into some kind of hierarchical relationship. They're just different things. So when one takes something from one genre, or one medium, orality, and puts it into another, television, you are syncretizing, you are hybridizing, you're creolizing those two forms. And again, feel free to hierarchicalize if you desire, but I don't think that this is necessarily a healthy way of approaching these, but we can still problematize. So what do we have? We have a century of the media landscape having fairy tales. Let's use the word fairy tales as one of the dominant things that are marketed towards children, because for the same reason that as the Grimms, the success of the Grimms, in that they were seen as inculcating some kind of value. They are safe, especially when you use your editorial hand and you remove the infelicities and you turn them from living, breathing, dynamic texts into something that is directed towards the child, and you are creating the idea of the child as a protected state over the long 19th century. And television becomes this further opportunity for it. And there's also things like, one of the benefits of putting traditional stories on television is that no one owns them, in that sense of they're not copyrighted works, which is a point that Hearne kind of doesn't talk about explicitly, except in terms of sort of the Western fairy tale, but actually makes it critical when she talks about Indigenous narratives on television. So then we have the idea of some form of all too late, and we can lament the fact that it is too late, and we ought to lament the fact that it's too late, but the opportunity for using this thing, which is a fun medium. Television is a fun thing, children's television is a fun thing, and the creation of these, we don't always have to be having this dour conservatism when it comes to the adaptation. We can still, it doesn't mean that we suspend our critical apparatus, but it doesn't mean that we only introduce how things have been changing, as if change is an inherently negative act. So we have this thing, we have children's television. We have children's television that children in the West, colonizer children in the West, and First Nations children in the West have been exposed to and have found delight in. This is great, and some of the stuff is sort of, Western European fairy tales, and that's cool, and that's fun, and you can enjoy those things. But the idea is that stories aren't being told. So the Indigenous stories aren't being told in the same way. And so now we have this opportunity. We have this opportunity because APTN was created and National Film Board had been around, and this is not unique to Canada. Similar things happen similar things are happening in Australia, New Zealand. Similar things are happening in the United States. I believe similar things are happening in Brazil, but don't quote me on that. But a lot of the colonized world is slowly, again, belatedly, but slowly opening up to the idea of representation in media, in large part because the media landscape has opened up and you can do this. So it's like, well, when we had 3 channels, no, but now we have 100 channels, you can have one. And it's like, great, thanks. And it's like, okay, well, we can still make use of this. So, but how do you do this thing? Because now you have this desire for representation, which is a positive thing, this desire to have not just European stories, but First Nation Canadian stories on the screen. And so that people with at least two intended audiences in place. One specifically, First Nations children who can see, if not necessarily their own nation, then at least another Canadian First Nation stories on television that isn't of a European ancestry. And conversely, the opportunity for a non-First Nations child to experience these stories as well. And to say, oh, okay. And to be, perhaps, again, in this sort of a global idealism, the idea of, hey, why don't we introduce children to the vast array of narratives of this place early, before they even have the opportunity to cynically categorize them, and just like, no, this is just part of the landscape, part of the verbal landscape. Cool. So how do you do that? Because we have all these conventions. We have this idea of it's not an established pattern per se, but it's children's television and the use of fairy tale on it has been influenced by our understanding of children's literature and the textual traditions of fairy tales and the sort of deracinated idea of them, that they just become this time outside of time and a place outside of place, but who are we kidding? Rural Germany and so on. But now we have Western ideas of the role of this, and even the role of the fairy tale, this definition of the fairy tale as something that is fictional, as something that is wondrous, as something that is not purporting to be reality. So we have First Nations tales that resemble European tales in some structural elements. And so, you can read them in this way, but they don't necessarily fit into the category of fiction in the same way. They're epistemologically different. They are not, this is something that doesn't happen, but let us use it as an illustration. There is a spiritual element to them that just defies the strict categorization. So you want to sort of include, the idea is to include, to incorporate, to have these narratives represented, but not have them mistaken for being entirely analogous. So what do you do? And what do you do when you have the conventions of television, where you only have 22 minutes or 11 minutes if you're talking a 15-minute program? What do you do when you are moving away from orality to visual depiction, where the showing and the not telling? And so the article basically points these out, that First Nations storytelling to this day is not simply there because of the absence of a textual tradition. It serves a specific pedagogical function, and I know I've just been talking about how in the 19th century we decided that tales had a pedagogical function when we were creating childhood, but that was sort of like through a European channel. But she emphasizes that no, it is an ongoing, and it's an ongoingly creative process that is there, and it's there doubly. I think she makes this point. It's there doubly precisely because, not simply through the absence of a textual tradition for these narratives, and so like by default we have to use storytelling, which is a very cynical way of looking at it, but because there is a presence of colonizer narrative, and so the orality and the oral tradition and contemporary First Nation storytelling is in part, I was going to say a rebuttal or a rebuff or a bulwark against, but there's a complementarity. Because I think one of the most fascinating things that she talks about is that you have this engagement with this thing. And let's not call it simply European folktale. Let's talk about the conventions of fairy tale television for children. And we'll still use the word fairy tale, but these are conventions, and these are things that can be delightful. These are things that can be proven effective as a piece of entertainment. And so, how do First Nations filmmakers and television producers engage in this? And they engage in it in a creative way. It is not an imposition of it. It is not. It is not surrendering to the conventions that are established, nor is it the square peg, round hole, vain exercise of trying to replicate in its entirety the dynamics of First Nations storytelling in this new medium, because it's a different medium, and concessions would need to be made if on Earth 2, the television landscape and the history of mediatization had been dominated by First Nations since its inception, because they are different beasts. Plus, you have an audience, a First Nations children's audience, that is familiar and finds delight and grasps the conventions of these, Euro fairy tale television. And so that's the audience that you are also trying to engage. And it allows for dynamism. It allows for creativity. It allows for figuring out something that is wholly new. There's some really interesting parallels. Media critic Karen Thompson has written about Bruno Mars, for example, and that we should not forget Bruno Mars's Filipino context, because in the Philippines you have this other colonized population where one of the creative impulses of the colonized people within the Philippines is to become remarkably adept at and familiar with, in part not simply because they have no choice, but in a sort of this radical embrace of the popular culture of the colonizer. And so there's this what he produces is both incredibly drenched in a deep understanding of American popular music that is in itself a continuation of Filipino culture that is, by virtue of its history, syncretic. And by virtue of its history, that is a dominant theme within prior to colonization. The Mi'kmaq fiddler Lee Cremo is a similar thing, because you get Lee Cremo, and he's this fantastic fiddler, and his stuff is very much akin to the Cape Breton Celtic fiddle tradition. And so then the question is, well, can a First Nations person play Scottish fiddle? I don't know. And it becomes this laden binary that people had. The people, mainly the Scottish critics, or the Cape Breton Scottish critical class, who treasured his performances but had some difficulty reconciling it. Whereas Cremo and the Mi'kmaq community discussing Cremo basically said he is demonstrating a classic Mi'kmaq facility of taking influences and making something new from them, of incorporation, and that he is continuing this skill set that has always been, even pre-contact, it has always been part of Mi'kmaq culture. And what's great is that kind of idea severs this false binary between what is age old and unsullied by external influences. That classic folkloric dilemma of like, once something becomes influenced by something else, it somehow is rendered less authentic. And rather think of a internalized aesthetic, an internalized device, an internalized understanding within many, many cultures is adaptation. And that there is fluidity. And there is creativity within that act of adaptation. And she points out various strategies that is used to still, nevertheless, reaffirm certain things that they do not want erased as they move into this new opportunity for sharing of stories. And one of them is they don't want the particular nation erased. They don't want it to be in some kind of pan-Canadian rural setting. They want it identified with the particular nation that it comes from and the particular landscape. And those are depicted even in the most representational or figurative pieces of animation. That landscape is still there. Important national cultural symbols and aesthetics are incorporated into the animation and into the depiction. Color palette, things that are of cultural significance are brought into this new medium, or this different medium. Voices, incredibly important. It's the casting, not simply because they're often done bilingually, so in English and in the particular First Nations language, and so you need people who are fluent in both, and therefore you are 99.9% of the time going to be going to not a second language learner, but a native speaker, so to speak. Forgive the accidental pun. But even if it isn't going to be also available, you want those voices, you want those accents, and it's important that not simply on the practical level of having fluency, but the representational level. And let's not forget the economic level. These are ways of paying actors and so on. And I mean, one of the things about a piece of popular entertainment is that it's an employer. And whenever you sort of complain about like a $100 million movie, for example, and then you sort of point out various budgets, and you think, yeah, but look at the credits and see how many hundreds of people had work for a particular period of time. And so it's the ridiculous size of it. A lot of that goes to salaries for people, and so it's like, all right, temper your expectations. The movie can still be crap. You can still complain. But when we think about these projects and who's getting them, it's like, oh, well, this is money that goes back into the community. So this is also on a pure, not necessarily capitalist per se, but on a pure sort of monetary thing. This is a good thing. People are getting jobs. And these people are getting jobs and not external voice actors. So representation works on a number of different ways. But most importantly, these two factors, is that the very idea of storytelling is baked in to the narratives, and that all these cartoons, all these animated shows have a framing device of telling that these are stories, and they're named stories where the nation, the person, sometimes even the family, is identified as the source of this story, and the act of storytelling is represented. You might eventually work yourself the animators might work themselves into, what Catherine Young would call sort of the tale world. So go from the story world to the tale world, and that's often framed through like a different animation style. So you go into, you start with something like rotoscopic to show the person who is telling the story, and then it morphs into a different style that depicts the story that is being told. And that's sort of a critical move. And then finally, even within the tale world, the role of storytelling is emphasized. And so, however far removed a online television program might be from orality, it's emphasized. But let's remember that orality is important. Let's remember that these are created in moments with people. That these are communicative acts that have their natural home in a storytelling event. And finally, the idea that they are pedagogic, that this information is given very clear. What lessons were learned? Cards come up, and it's like, this is about teaching. She uses the word, almost excessively so, but not excessive in terms of too much for a child to understand. They're not like overburdened with the pedagogical aspect of it, but they are certainly, it will not slip past them. This is something to be learned from. And going back to that sort of standard thing. So there's a couple other things she touches on, and they're good to know, like what happens when you almost have to repeat that grim editorial hand when you take a First Nation story and the antagonist is a cannibal, and it's like you can't have cannibals on children's television. It's like okay, we got to make some sorts of changes. So how is it adapted to the conventions or the requirements of children's television? And so how do you do that creatively? You could see it as an obstacle, you could see it as a creative solution, and you could see it as I'm not going to win this fight, I'm going to win another fight. There's the issues of some really fascinating issues, like there are certain tales that are only told in certain times a year. There's like winter tales and summer tales. It's like, so how do you work that into a broadcast expectation where, for the most part, once a show is available, it's like up to the broadcaster's discretion when to show it. And it's like, no, you can't show this. This is not a story for summer. This is a story for winter. Like, how do you do that? I kind of have the feeling, I might be wrong, but I kind of have the feeling that one of the reasons why many of these aren't available on YouTube, for example, are those kind of restrictions. There's, on one hand, this is programming that really only survives through viewership that can have advertising associated with it and so on. So it's probably a reluctance to put them on this side of a paywall. That's totally okay. But also, it's like, really? You can't see this now. You can see this in winter. And once it becomes sort of escaped online, you might not be able to have that control. But these are all sort of really fascinating questions. So we have this thing. We have folk narrative. And we have, as I said, we've had, this royal colonizer, has had 200 years of more or less some kind of mediation being the dominant mode. Maybe you are fortunate in that you have access to someone who is sort of a gifted storyteller, and storytelling is part of your community. Even so, that gifted storyteller might be as much influenced by literary works than some kind of, I hate to say it, but I'm not going to say it, but someone who's only learned their repertoire through a chain of a pure oral tradition. Maybe you have that in your community. I would imagine that it is largely unlikely, but maybe not if you're First Nations, because where that is, again, through choice and also through circumstance, in terms of not having the textual tradition because the textual tradition typically requires privilege in order for that to happen. You have that. But for the most part, we've got this royalist or colonizer has mediation. And this mediation has spread. And this mediation becomes an influence that influences both colonizer and colonized populations as well. And it is, whatever its history, it is a thing. And the thing itself might be delightful, might be entertaining. So how do people take this, grapple with it, see its limitations, see its possibilities, and turn it into something that moves towards better representation? Representation not simply on the level of plot, but representation in terms of what stories do. That's why I really like this article. It just works so very well. As I said, most of the examples that are cited are behind paywalls, but one is an NFB film. It's called How People Got Fire, and I'm going to put a link to that in the description as well. It's a National Film Board thing, so you can check it out for yourself. Anyway, I've been talking a long time, so I'm going to stop. What have I been talking about? I've been talking about Joanna Hearne's I Am Not a Fairy Tale, Indigenous Storytelling on Canadian television. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Be well. See you later, and bye-bye.